Today, we're going to talk about full moral status, the qualification for full consideration as a moral patient. We'll debate ways of measuring moral status, whether it's a scalar property that can be measured by degrees, a threshold property that you either have or you don't once you reach a certain measurement of something, or a quality that isn't measurable at all in terms of degrees. We'll also talk about the sources of moral status. That is, whether it's an internal quality of beings or something imparted on them externally. What we'll see along our journey is that, depending on which of these elements we foreground, we'll leave certain people out or bring others in. I will argue that all of the options I've described ultimately create a circle where they lead into one another, and that we need a more inclusive, non-scalar approach if we want to escape this cycle. I'm going to explore 3 accounts of FMS, and demonstrate that they all ultimately rely on similarly arbitrary distinctions about qualities, and that these measurements produce problems of who is left out or brought in. The first is human specialness, or HS. Humans have something unique about us that means we, and only we, all have full moral status. But there's nothing particularly unique about humans that no other animal shares, and if they do share it, we must move to the second, Scalar Indicators, or SI. There is a particular degree of an internal quality that grants moral status, either in tiers or a scale up to full moral status, which problematically leaves some humans behind and lets in some animals and is somewhat arbitrary. So we may turn to the third, External Mutuality, or EM. We are given FMS by virtue of a relationship with others and their relationship to us, which depend on appeals to purity that ultimately suggest HS again. McMahon presents these distinctions as 2 problems. The separation problem, which is the task of proving the common sense view that all human beings are owed a form of consideration that is different from and higher than that which is owed to other animals. And the second is the equality problem, which is to show how that form of consideration can be owed equally to all human beings. These 3 paradigms represent different points on a recursive cycle that fails to answer the question, why does anyone have moral value? I will argue that attempts to resolve one of these 2 problems seem commonly to fall into the trap of the other, which suggests that the solution must be something inclusive, non-scalar, and necessary, or in other words, internal to the beings we're evaluating. The common sense idea that humans have moral status by virtue of species membership is appealing to liberal philosophy. But what is it about humans that makes us uniquely moral? The work of animal ethologists like Franz de Waal, cognitive scientists like Beckhoff and Peirce, and philosophers like Donovan Schafer suggests that the morality and beliefs of humans are not fundamentally different from our non-human kin. Rationality and language tend to be the few categories that we hold on to as a Rubicon between us, though developments in AI and animal ethology increasingly challenge these ideas. So, when we ask what it is exactly that makes humans special, the answer tends to fail to include every individual human. Instead, philosophers rely on the average of what is in fact a scalar property. Christine Korsgaard is the most honest and direct of these philosophers in that she simply acknowledges that species membership is a way of getting around the problem of unequal rationality. She sees human beings as having membership of the kind rational agents. In other words, species membership grants binary access to FMS on the basis that the average human is a rational agent. Other species membership claims may depend on ideas like development over a life cycle or genetics, but these arguments always depend on an average human as their reference. And so, in the end, there's little difference between the human specialness argument and the scalar indicator argument, because they're both doing measurements. One simply averages those measurements and aggregates the results by kind. One of the primary appeals of HS is that it allows all humans in. One of the primary problems with SI is that it leaves some humans out. In a fully scalar model of moral status, we would evaluate people based on a criterion we would measure, often but not exclusively empirically, and then assign people moral status based on their abilities. Most commonly, scalar arguments evaluate rationality or interests. Rationality is not exactly something we can directly and empirically measure, but it is a reasonable inference from empirical qualities like frontal cortex activity or other evaluations of cognitive complexity. According to arguments of this sort, most humans demonstrate higher cognitive capacity than most other animals. Therefore, most humans have a higher degree of moral status than most other animals. Another version of this is to examine interests, often measured by the complexity of one's ability to plan for the future, or the quality of their lives, or their ability to feel pain. While interests are not immediately empirical, they can be deduced from behavior and cognitive capacity. But, if language and rationality are the indicators, then what do we do with those who cannot speak, or whose rationality is less than mine? And what do we do with non-human animals, cetaceans, apes, corvids, who demonstrate higher degrees of rationality and forethought than some humans like children, those with IDD, or people in various states of coma or dementia? Some philosophers ameliorate this problem by respecting those humans that have only parts of rationality on the basis of their rational nature. That, as humans, they have at least the potential to be rational, or would if their human bodies functioned, quote, normally. Others suggest that we measure cognitively diminished or less developed humans by cognitive surrogacy, or the idea that other members of their species can and do step in to exercise rationality for them. Here, we see the inconsistency of this argument. These philosophers use scalar measurements of rationality to establish FMS as ultimately a binary concept. Humans have it, non-humans don't. That lands us back at HS. The result is a paradoxical recursion. If we rely on human specialness, outside of religious explanations, we cannot explain which internal quality humans possess that non-humans do not, or why that quality is a moral quality. If we rely on scalar indicators, we will have to leave out some humans and bring in some animals. In an attempt to dodge this error, McMahon poses a double-pronged approach to this problem in The Ethics of Killing, which posits that those below a particular threshold matter by virtue of others fitting concern for their good, and those above the threshold are respected for their inherent worth, along with a third, intermediate tier for the gray areas. Ultimately, this leads him to conclude that radically impaired human beings and some higher non-human animals have roughly the same degree of inviolability as a young child. McMahon's particularism allows him to evade the problem of coherence that would leave out some humans or would admit some animals by simply embracing that complexity. However, the tiered system still relies on scalar measurements of attributes that ultimately lead to the same lack of coherence. Even if the boundaries between tiers are marked by thick lines, say a gray area between 40 to 60% of average just in case, those lines that separate moral equals from other sentient beings are unavoidably arbitrary and implausibly associate an insignificant difference in empirical reality with a momentous difference in moral status. So, if scalar determinations are always arbitrary both in their measurements and in their connection to morality, and species membership ultimately relies on similarly arbitrary reductions, it seems as though internal qualities often produce dead ends. Many in the disability studies community, such as Alice Crary, object to scalar measurements that compare marginal cases, like humans who experience intellectual and physical differences, with non-human animals, and especially to the claim that some non-human animals matter more than some of those humans. This is unsurprising, given arguments like Peter Singer's claim that we should prioritize the interests based on sentience or the capacity to feel of some animals over the interests of severely cognitively impaired humans. Instead, these philosophers often turn to external mutuality, or EM, as a source of FMS. In other words, FMS is bestowed upon us by the attitudes, actions, or relationships of others. Whether this is the capacity to care, biosocial relations like family, love, or joint commitment to one another, other humans offer an external locus for moral standing. As Mulhall puts it, to see another human being is to see her as a fellow creature, another being whose embodiment embeds her in a distinctive form of common life with language and culture, and whose existence constitutes a particular kind of claim on us. Other people give us FMS when they recognize our FMS. The tautological circularity of this argument is not a problem, so long as we are willing to define FMS as something that arises epiphenomenally out of relationships. The trouble with these externally located arguments, however, is that they rely on equally arbitrary boundaries. but these are of quality rather than quantity. Certainly, many non-human animals can show both inter- and intra-species care. They forge kinship bonds with their parents, even animals that tend to be solitary once grown. They show love or share commitments to projects and interests. And so, ultimately, a qualitative external distinction like Graeber's argument for a unique modality of love as opposed to lesser love depends on insisting that a human and, say, a dog cannot be friends in the same way that one human is friends with another human, or that love for animals is a deficient mode of the sort of love we typically reserve for persons. In the end, each of these characteristics must rely on an appeal to purity that says, this is a real relationship, read, a human relationship, and this is mere simulacrum. The community of disabled persons are absolutely right to object to the dehumanization of people with disabilities. But, as Taylor argues, we must reconcile the brutal reality of human animalization with the concurrent need to challenge the devaluing of animals and even acknowledge our own animality. To acknowledge the complexity of animals' moral status doesn't necessarily need to bring down other humans. In fact, as Chemical argues, the more sharply people distinguish between humans and animals, the more likely they are to dehumanize other humans. And so, if we let go of the specialness of humans, we can move away from having to prove the humanity of someone with IDD, for example, and instead move toward accepting their vulnerability. Logically, then, we need a basis for FMS that depends on internal qualities, but that is not scalar and does not depend on human specialness. Defining that basis goes beyond the purposes of this video, but I suggest that we might well begin by combining Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach that explores what an animal can do and aims to do, with Spinoza's affectus, the embodied capacity to affect and to be affected by other bodies. But that will have to wait for another video.